Imagine growing up with a mother who ruled an empire whose name echoed through history books. How do you carve out your own identity, your own legacy when you're living in the shadow of a legend? Welcome to my channel Words of Time and join me as I explore the incredible lives of the often overlooked daughters of iconic queens, revealing the hidden power and influence they wielded, despite being overshadowed. Throughout history, the stories of powerful queens have fascinated generations. Names like Catherine the Great, Queen Elizabeth I, and Cleopatra are almost mythical in their grandeur. They are remembered as rulers who defied the norms of their time, commanding empires and shaping the fate of nations. Their intelligence, political skill, and presence transformed the way female leadership was perceived in patriarchal societies. Yet behind their glittering reigns lies a quieter story, one that history rarely tells. While these women secured their places in the annals of power, their daughters or female heirs often faded into the shadows, remembered, if at all, as footnotes to their mothers' legends. These forgotten figures lived complex lives that reflected both the burden and the privilege of being born to greatness. They navigated worlds that both revered and restricted them, inheriting not only bloodlines but also expectations, ambitions, and often silent suffering. The prevailing narrative around these queens tends to celebrate their extraordinary independence. Catherine the Great is hailed as a reformer who modernized Russia, Queen Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen who ruled England with unmatched skill, and Cleopatra as the last pharaoh of Egypt who held her empire together against the expanding power of Rome. Each of these women embodied a version of power that seemed almost impossible in their time, and in doing so they became cultural icons. Yet the women who came after them, particularly their daughters or granddaughters, found themselves living in the long shadows cast by their mothers' legacies. History's gaze, captivated by the spectacle of royal power and intrigue, often passed over these daughters who played subtler, though no less significant, roles in shaping dynasties and sustaining influence. Consider, for instance, Empress Elizabeth Alexeievna, the granddaughter of Catherine the Great through her son Paul. She was born into a world already dominated by her grandmother's image. Catherine the Great had transformed the Russian Empire, expanding its borders, cultivating the arts, and turning St. Petersburg into one of Europe's cultural capitals. Elizabeth Alexeievna, though often treated as a figure of grace rather than of action, possessed her own form of quiet authority. Married to Emperor Alexander I, she became part of a political landscape shaped by her grandmother's ambitions and ideals. While Catherine's story is one of conquest and reform, Elizabeth's influence was expressed through mediation, diplomacy, and personal strength in a court filled with intrigue. Her life represents a subtler legacy of female power, one not built on conquest but on endurance, restraint, and the art of survival within structures she could not directly control. The case of Catherine Carey offers another example of a woman obscured by proximity to greatness. Though not Elizabeth I's direct daughter, she was her cousin and lifelong confidant, raised within the same courtly environment that produced one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history. Catherine Carey's life illustrates how power often extended through kinship, loyalty, and service rather than formal titles. She was the daughter of Mary Boleyn, sister to Anne Boleyn, whose brief and tragic marriage to Henry VIII produced Elizabeth. Growing up in the volatile atmosphere of Tudor politics, Catherine learned early that survival at court required intelligence and discretion. She became a trusted attendant and friend to Queen Elizabeth, serving in the royal household for decades. Though her name rarely appears in major histories, her presence was constant behind the scenes, offering stability to a queen who could trust few people. In her role as a confidant, Catherine Carey wielded an invisible form of power, one that shaped the queen's personal and political decisions alike. Her story shows how influence could thrive even without recognition, and how women like her held together the emotional and social fabric of royal courts. Perhaps the most striking example of a daughter who lived in the shadows of an extraordinary mother is Cleopatra Selene, the only surviving child of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. After her parents' defeat and deaths, Selene was taken to Rome and paraded in Octavian's triumph, a living reminder of Egypt's fall. Yet instead of fading into obscurity, she rebuilt her life within the empire that had destroyed her family. Eventually she became Queen of Mauretania, ruling alongside her husband King Juba II. Though her reign is rarely discussed in popular retellings of her mother's story, Cleopatra Selene played a crucial role in merging Egyptian, Greek and Roman cultural elements into a distinctive and prosperous North African kingdom. She maintained her mother's legacy of intelligence and adaptability, turning exile into opportunity. Her survival and success demonstrate a remarkable capacity to transform inherited trauma into political strength. In many ways, Cleopatra Selene fulfilled the same ambitions that her mother once pursued, maintaining sovereignty, asserting identity, and shaping a world that sought to erase her lineage. These three women, Empress Elizabeth Alexeievna, Catherine Carey, and Cleopatra Selene, represent different centuries, cultures, and empires, yet their experiences share a common thread. Each was born into the orbit of a dominant female figure whose legend defined the age. Their lives were marked by a struggle to assert individuality in the shadow of fame, and by their ability to influence the course of events from behind veils of modesty or restraint. The popular fascination with their mother's grandeur often erases the subtler ways these daughters exercised authority. They did not lead armies or sign historic treaties, but they shaped relationships, mediated conflicts, and safeguarded legacies. Their stories reveal that power can exist not only in visible dominance but also in quiet perseverance and moral strength. The tendency to overlook these women reflects a broader pattern in how history records female influence. Society has long favored the spectacle of visible rule, the drama of courts, battles, and revolutions, over the hidden forms of agency that often sustain those very systems. When historians celebrate queens like Catherine the Great or Elizabeth I, they tend to frame their power as exceptional, as if female authority were a rare and fleeting phenomenon. This framing leaves little room to acknowledge the generations of women who maintained political and familial stability through subtlety and skill. The daughters, nieces, and granddaughters of these great queens lived in a space where power had to be disguised, softened, or redirected through personal relationships. Yet their ability to adapt to these conditions reveals a sophistication that deserves recognition equal to that of their more famous mothers. Empress Elizabeth Alexeievna's influence, for example, can be seen in her role during the Napoleonic Wars, when her counsel and compassion helped temper the often conflicting impulses of her husband, Emperor Alexander I. She represented the moral and emotional balance within a court driven by ambition and political rivalry. Her restraint and dignity offered a model of leadership distinct from Catherine the Great's assertive style but no less important for maintaining the integrity of the Russian monarchy. Similarly, Catherine Carey's loyalty to Elizabeth I provided the Queen with emotional grounding at a time when betrayal and suspicion defined court life. Carey's enduring presence ensured a sense of continuity within the constantly shifting alliances of Tudor England. And Cleopatra Selene's reign in Mauretania stands as proof that dynastic strength could survive even the total collapse of an empire. She turned her heritage into a bridge between civilizations, blending Egyptian grandeur with Roman administrative skill and African cultural vitality. These women also challenge the assumption that history's secondary figures are mere reflections of greater personalities. While their mothers' or cousins' achievements dominate historical narratives, the daughters' contributions often reveal how power can be inherited, reinterpreted, and humanized. Empress Elizabeth Alexeievna's life shows the emotional dimension of empire. Catherine Carey's devotion exposes the interpersonal foundations of governance, and Cleopatra Selene's reign illustrates the adaptability of dynastic legacy. In each case, the daughter transforms what she inherits into something uniquely her own, even as public memory fails to preserve her name with the same reverence. The erasure of these women from mainstream history also reveals how storytelling shapes perception. Historians and chroniclers, often working within male-dominated traditions, preferred tales of conquest, seduction, and rebellion, narratives that fit established expectations of heroism or scandal. The quiet endurance of a woman who maintained a kingdom's moral center or rebuilt a life from exile rarely provided material for dramatic retelling. As a result, the legacy of these daughters became muted, embedded in the achievements of others. Yet when their lives are revisited with care, they reveal an essential truth about the nature of influence, that it is not always loud or visible, but often woven into the unseen fabric of relationships and decisions that shape history. This dynamic between mother and daughter also invites reflection on how power is transmitted across generations. Catherine the Great's reforms created an environment in which women of the Russian court could hold intellectual and social authority unprecedented in Europe. Elizabeth Alexeievna inherited not only a political system but also an expectation of sophistication and moral refinement. Elizabeth I's disciplined reign, rooted in careful image control and personal restraint, likely owed much to the lessons she learned from watching women like Catherine Carey navigate the dangers of Tudor politics. Cleopatra's story, though dominated by tragedy, produced in her daughter a sense of strategic patience and cultural fluency that proved vital in her own rule. In each case, the daughter embodies the emotional and philosophical inheritance of the mother, translating power from one form to another. What makes these daughters particularly fascinating is that their influence persisted even when history forgot them. They left marks not through dramatic deeds but through the quiet continuity they ensured. The survival of institutions, dynasties, and cultural values often depended on such figures who worked behind the scenes. The notion of the unseen daughter thus becomes a metaphor for the many women throughout history whose lives contributed to the stability of societies but whose names remain absent from monuments and textbooks. To explore their stories is to uncover the connective tissue between the great moments of history, the subtle links that allow grand narratives to endure. Their overlooked stories also challenge the way we understand female power itself. When we think of queens like Catherine the Great or Cleopatra, we often imagine exceptional individuals who broke through constraints to claim authority equal to men. But their daughters' experiences suggest another kind of power, one grounded in adaptation, emotional intelligence, and the ability to work within existing limits without surrendering agency. This form of influence, though less visible, may have been more sustainable and pervasive. It shaped generations and ensured that the legacy of these queens did not end with their own lifetimes. As we look deeper into the lives of these women, it becomes clear that history's fascination with spectacle has come at a cost. The dramatic rise and fall of rulers make for compelling stories, but they obscure the quieter, enduring legacies that unfold in their aftermath. The daughters who lived in the shadow of greatness often carried the responsibility of maintaining what their mothers built, or of reconstructing it after it crumbled. Their resilience, patience, and quiet defiance form an essential part of the story of female leadership across time. The modern reader may find in these women an unexpected form of relevance. In a world that often celebrates visible success and public achievement, the lessons of Empress Elizabeth Alexeievna, Catherine Carey, and Cleopatra Selene remind us of the power inherent in restraint, empathy, and perseverance. Their stories urge us to look beyond the surface of history and recognize the value of influence that operates without applause. They demonstrate that legacy is not only about being remembered, but about shaping the course of events in ways that endure even when credit is denied. In uncovering their lives, we also gain a deeper understanding of their famous mothers. Catherine the Great's empire was not just built on reform and conquest, but on the generational strength that women like Elizabeth Alexeievna later embodied. Elizabeth I's disciplined reign depended on the loyalty and discretion of women like Catherine Carey, whose presence allowed the queen to project authority with confidence. Cleopatra's vision of cultural fusion and political resilience lived on through her daughter's reign in Mauretania. Each daughter serves as both a reflection and continuation of her mother's legacy, transforming inherited power into something quieter but equally vital. The journey into these hidden lives invites us to rethink what it means to wield power. It suggests that influence can exist even when unacknowledged, that endurance can be as transformative as action, and that the stories we overlook often hold the deepest insights into human strength. The history of queens may be written in gold and marble, but the history of their daughters is written in the subtle gestures that sustain empires. The letters exchanged, the alliances maintained, the dignity preserved amid chaos. As we turn from these introductory reflections toward a closer examination of each woman, we begin to see how the legacies of Catherine the Great, Elizabeth I, and Cleopatra extend far beyond their own lifetimes. Their daughters and descendants, though largely invisible in the historical record, continued to shape the moral, political, and cultural landscapes of their worlds. To bring their stories to light is not merely to correct an oversight, but to restore a fuller, richer understanding of history itself. It is an invitation to see the past not only through the triumphs of the visible few, but through the endurance of those who remained hidden in plain sight. The story of Cleopatra Selene begins in the long shadow of one of history's most unforgettable figures. Her mother, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, has come to embody the very idea of female power, seduction, and tragedy. few names evoke such an immediate image of splendor and downfall. Cleopatra's reign, marked by her intelligence and audacity, shaped the fate of empires, but it also consumed those closest to her. When she and Mark Antony fell to the forces of Octavian, soon to become Augustus, their legacy seemed destined to end with them. The political world they had built, woven through love and ambition, collapsed overnight. In the aftermath, their surviving children, especially their daughter Cleopatra Selene, became living reminders of a dynasty's fall. Her mother's death left Selene orphaned, a captive in a world that saw her both as a trophy and a threat. Yet, in a turn that history almost ignored, Cleopatra Selene would rebuild what had been destroyed. Her journey from a prisoner in Rome to a queen in Mauretania is one of the most remarkable transformations in ancient history, a story of endurance, intelligence, and subtle influence that rivals even that of her mother. Cleopatra's life had been lived on a grand stage. She was not merely a ruler but a symbol of defiance against Rome's growing dominance. She spoke many languages, governed one of the wealthiest kingdoms of her time, and shaped the politics of the Mediterranean with her alliances. Her relationship with Julius Caesar had secured her throne, and her later partnership with Mark Antony had positioned Egypt as a key power in the struggle for control of Rome. But these same choices sealed her fate. When Antony's forces were defeated at Actium and both he and Cleopatra took their own lives, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. The Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled for nearly 300 years came to an end. For the young Cleopatra Selene, who had grown up surrounded by luxury, scholars, and ceremony, the fall of her parents' kingdom was more than a loss of home, it was a loss of identity. Her childhood, once shaped by the glitter of Alexandria's court, ended in the cold reality of Roman captivity. After her parents' deaths, Cleopatra Selene and her twin brother Alexander Helios were taken to Rome, along with their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus. The children were paraded in Octavian's triumph, displayed as living proof of his victory over Egypt. For the Romans, the sight of these royal captives symbolized the end of Cleopatra's ambition and the complete absorption of Egypt into the empire. For the children, it was humiliation and fear. Stripped of their royal titles, they became political hostages in the heart of the empire that had destroyed their family. Yet even in defeat, Cleopatra's daughter possessed a resilience that her captors could not extinguish. Under the care of Octavia, the sister of Octavian and former wife of Mark Antony, Selene was given an education befitting her noble birth. Octavia's household was a haven of culture and learning, and in that environment, Selene began to rebuild a sense of purpose. The contrast between her mother's dramatic end and Octavia's composed dignity provided the young princess with a different model of power, one rooted in restraint, diplomacy, and adaptation. In Rome, Cleopatra Selene learned to navigate a world where she was both admired and watched. The Romans were fascinated by her heritage. She was the daughter of Cleopatra, whose image had been transformed into a symbol of both exotic allure and moral decay. To survive, Selene had to learn how to exist within this narrative without being destroyed by it. Her Roman education exposed her to philosophy, literature, and politics. She absorbed the values of her captors while quietly preserving her Egyptian identity. This ability to balance dual worlds would later define her reign in Mauretania. Though she appeared subdued in public, those who knew her described a sharp intelligence and calm authority. She understood that survival in Rome meant mastering its culture without surrendering her own. Her eventual marriage to Juba, the young Numidian prince who had also been brought to Rome as a captive, marked the beginning of her transformation from orphaned royal to reigning queen. Juba's story mirrored her own. His father, King Juba of Numidia, had supported Pompey against Julius Caesar and lost everything in the war. Like Selene, he had been taken to Rome and raised in Octavian's household. Educated in the Roman manner, he became both loyal to the empire and deeply aware of his outsider status. When Octavian decided to install him as king of Mauretania, a region in North Africa that required firm yet cultured leadership, he also arranged his marriage to Cleopatra Selene. The union was both political and symbolic, joining two royal lines that had been subdued by Rome but were now expected to serve its interests. For Selene, this marriage offered not only stability but also a chance to reclaim the dignity that captivity had denied her. As Queen of Mauretania, Cleopatra Selene began to express her power in ways that reflected both her Ptolemaic heritage and her Roman education. She and Juba ruled from their capital, Caesarea, which they transformed into a thriving center of art, architecture, and scholarship. The city bore the marks of their dual inheritance. Egyptian motifs blended with Roman engineering, Greek artistic styles merged with North African traditions. Under their reign, Mauretania became a meeting point of cultures, a living reflection of the cosmopolitan world Cleopatra Selene had once known in Alexandria. Her influence could be seen not only in the city's design but also in its policies. She encouraged trade, supported learning, and cultivated relationships with neighboring kingdoms. Though her husband held formal authority, it was clear that Selene's intellect and cultural vision shaped the identity of their realm. One of the most striking aspects of Cleopatra Selene's reign was her ability to craft a public image that honored her mother's legacy without being overwhelmed by it. Coins issued during her time as queen depict symbols that blend Egyptian and Roman iconography, a subtle assertion of continuity between the Ptolemaic past and the new world she was helping to shape. On some, the crescent moon appears beside her name, a symbol that echoed both her mother's association with the goddess Isis and her own identity as Selene, named for the Greek moon goddess. Through these symbols, she maintained a link to her Egyptian roots while presenting herself as a legitimate and loyal Roman ally. It was a delicate balance that required constant negotiation, but Cleopatra Selene managed it with remarkable skill. Her reign demonstrated that power could be exercised not through rebellion but through synthesis, by finding harmony between conflicting worlds. The political landscape of the time was volatile, and Mauretania occupied a crucial position on the edges of the Roman Empire. It served as both a buffer and a bridge between Rome and the African territories beyond its reach. Cleopatra Selene and Juba used this position wisely, aligning themselves closely with Augustus while maintaining a degree of autonomy that allowed them to foster local culture and governance. Their court attracted scholars, artists, and philosophers from across the Mediterranean. This intellectual flowering mirrored the spirit of Alexandria, where Selene had spent her early years. In reviving that spirit, she reclaimed part of her mother's lost world, but she did so in a quieter, more enduring way. Where Cleopatra had defied Rome with open challenge, her daughter strengthened her kingdom by weaving Roman order into an African and Hellenistic fabric. Her mother's dramatic defiance had ended in destruction. Her own careful adaptation led to stability and prosperity. Despite her political success, Cleopatra Selene's life remained marked by loss and memory. The legacy of her mother haunted her, shaping how others perceived her and how she saw herself. Ancient writers mention that she maintained deep loyalty to her heritage, surrounding herself with symbols and rituals reminiscent of Egypt. Yet she also understood the limits of nostalgia. Her goal was not to recreate the past but to transform it. The Egypt she had lost could never return, but its ideals, its respect for learning, its aesthetic harmony, its sense of divine order, could live on through the culture she built in Mauretania. In this sense, Cleopatra Selene's life represents a reconciliation between inheritance and circumstance. She accepted the world as it was, yet she infused it with the spirit of the world that had been destroyed. Her influence extended beyond politics and culture into the realm of symbolism and identity. As a queen who embodied multiple civilizations, Cleopatra Selene stood at the intersection of histories. She was the daughter of Egypt's last pharaoh, the wife of a Roman-educated king, and the ruler of an African kingdom that thrived under her guidance. Her life challenged the rigid divisions that often define history. In her, the Mediterranean world's great traditions, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and African, found a moment of convergence. This synthesis was not merely artistic or political. It reflected a deeper understanding of survival and continuity. Cleopatra Selene proved that power could persist even after conquest, which identity could adapt without disappearing, and that the legacy of a fallen empire could find new expression in distant lands. The contrast between Cleopatra and her daughter reveals much about the evolution of female power in the ancient world. Cleopatra's reign was marked by visibility and drama. She ruled through charisma, spectacle, and direct challenge. Her daughter, by contrast, ruled through integration and restraint. Both approaches required immense intelligence and courage, but Selene's form of leadership, though less celebrated, proved more sustainable. In her ability to operate within the structures imposed upon her, she demonstrated a different kind of strength, one rooted in subtlety rather than confrontation. Her story suggests that the legacy of female authority did not vanish with the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It simply changed form, adapting to new realities. In many ways, Cleopatra Selene's life can be seen as a continuation of her mother's unfinished project. Cleopatra had sought to preserve Egypt's independence and cultural identity in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Selene achieved on a smaller scale what her mother could not: the creation of a stable, prosperous kingdom that balanced local pride with imperial cooperation. Through her marriage, her governance, and her cultural patronage, she ensured that the essence of Egypt's legacy would survive even under Roman rule. The temples, monuments, and artistic works produced in Mauretania under her reign bear witness to this continuity. They stand as quiet echoes of the grandeur of Alexandria, transposed into a new setting where they could endure without provoking destruction. Cleopatra Selene's reign also left a lasting mark on the generations that followed. The dynasty she and Juba established continued to rule Mauretania for decades, maintaining a delicate relationship with Rome. Even after her death, the influence of her vision persisted. Her life offered a model of how conquered peoples could assert dignity and identity within an empire that sought to absorb them. She embodied the idea that cultural synthesis, rather than submission or rebellion, could be a path to resilience. This insight would resonate through the centuries as other civilizations faced similar challenges of adaptation and survival under imperial rule. What makes Cleopatra Selene's story particularly compelling is how it illuminates the spaces between power and vulnerability. She was never free from the consequences of her parents' downfall, nor from the expectations of her Roman patrons. Yet within those constraints she found room to act, to shape, and to create. Her achievements did not erase the memory of her captivity, but they transformed it into something meaningful. By turning exile into opportunity, she redefined what it meant to inherit a broken legacy. Her mother's empire had fallen, but through her, its light continued to glow in another corner of the world. As her life draws into view, the connection to the broader pattern of unseen daughters becomes clearer. Like Empress Elizabeth Alexeievna and Catherine Carey, Cleopatra Selene navigated a world defined by another woman's greatness. Yet she found her own way to interpret and extend that legacy. Her reign, quiet yet luminous, reminds us that history's grand narratives are often sustained by those who rebuild in silence after the storm. Through her, the story of Cleopatra does not end in tragedy but evolves into one of endurance and renewal. The tale of Cleopatra Selene is, at its heart, a meditation on inheritance, how power, culture, and memory pass from one generation to the next. It reveals that the daughters of great women are not merely successors but interpreters, translating glory into continuity. Cleopatra Selene's life, shaped by loss and transformation, stands as a bridge between worlds, between Egypt and Rome, between mother and daughter, between collapse and creation. Her reign in Mauretania, though often forgotten, embodies the strength that lies in adaptation and the quiet courage to build anew from ruins. As her story unfolds, it deepens the understanding of those who came before her and those who followed. It reminds us that history's most enduring legacies are often the ones hidden beneath its brightest lights, waiting to be seen not as echoes of the past, but as voices that carried it forward. The life of Catherine Carey unfolds within one of the most intricate and politically charged courts in European history. Born into a family that had already changed the course of England through scandal and ambition, she carried the legacy of the Boleyn name at a time when it was both powerful and perilous. Her mother, Mary Boleyn, was sister to Anne Boleyn, whose marriage to King Henry transformed England's religion and monarchy forever. From the moment of her birth, Catherine's identity was tied to a lineage that symbolized both ascent and ruin. She grew up in a world where proximity to the throne brought immense privilege but also constant danger. Yet, unlike many who fell victim to the volatile politics of the Tudor court, Catherine Carey learned to navigate this world with tact, intelligence, and quiet strength. In doing so, she became one of Queen Elizabeth's most trusted confidants, shaping the atmosphere of the Elizabethan court in ways that history has only begun to recognize. Catherine's early life was marked by uncertainty. The circumstances of her birth were clouded by rumor, as many speculated that she was not the daughter of Mary Boleyn's husband, William Carey, but of King Henry himself. Though this question was never publicly addressed, it added an air of mystery to her position in the royal circle. What is certain is that her mother's connection to the king and her aunt's eventual marriage to him ensured that Catherine's life would be deeply entwined with the royal family. She received an education suited to a woman of her status, one that emphasized piety, discretion, and cultural refinement. These qualities, which might have seemed ordinary, became the foundation of her influence later in life. When Anne Boleyn's rise brought the Boleyn family to the center of power, Catherine witnessed both the triumph and the peril of ambition. She saw how quickly favor could turn to ruin when Anne fell from grace and was executed. The downfall of her aunt was a defining moment for her generation, teaching lessons about loyalty, caution, and the price of royal proximity. Yet Catherine did not retreat from public life. She continued to serve at court, first under Henry's later queens and then under his children. Her survival through the reigns of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth speaks to her ability to adapt. While others were consumed by religious and political turmoil, Catherine maintained a reputation for steadiness and integrity. This reliability would eventually earn her the complete trust of Queen Elizabeth, her cousin and sovereign. The relationship between Catherine Carey and Elizabeth was rooted in family, shared experience, and mutual respect. They had grown up within the same complex network of Tudor alliances, where bloodlines were both bonds and liabilities. Both women had witnessed the ruin of their mothers and the volatility of their fathers. These shared memories created an understanding between them that few others could match. When Elizabeth ascended to the throne, she surrounded herself with a carefully chosen circle of women she could trust. Among them, Catherine Carey stood out not for flamboyance or ambition but for quiet loyalty and competence. She was appointed Chief Lady of the Privy Chamber, a position that placed her at the Queen's side day and night. In an age when political power often depended on proximity, this role gave her immense, if understated, influence. As Chief Lady, Catherine was responsible for managing the Queen's private household and overseeing the women who attended her. This position required discretion above all else. The Privy Chamber was the heart of Elizabeth's personal world, a space where political decisions, emotional confidences, and state secrets intertwined. Catherine acted as both guardian and mediator, ensuring that access to the Queen was carefully controlled. She was often the first to hear whispers of court intrigue and the last to leave Elizabeth's side at night. Her presence provided the Queen with a sense of stability amid the shifting alliances of court life. In a reign defined by suspicion and the constant threat of betrayal, such loyalty was invaluable. Beyond her formal duties, Catherine Carey's influence lay in her ability to manage relationships within the court. The Elizabethan world was a labyrinth of competing interests, shaped by religious division and personal ambition. Protestant and Catholic factions vied for dominance, each seeking to sway the Queen's favor. Catherine, though firmly aligned with the Protestant faith that Elizabeth promoted, understood the importance of moderation. She had lived through the persecutions of Mary's reign and witnessed the dangers of zealotry. Her faith was sincere, but her politics were tempered by pragmatism. She encouraged restraint, advising tolerance where others demanded confrontation. In this way she mirrored Elizabeth's own approach to governance, steady, cautious, and guided by balance rather than extremes. This ability to navigate religious and political tension made Catherine a valuable intermediary. When conflicts arose between courtiers, she often acted as a quiet negotiator, using her influence to defuse tensions before they reached the Queen. Her diplomacy extended beyond the palace walls, as she maintained correspondence with key figures in the nobility and the church. These letters, though often simple in tone, reveal a woman deeply engaged in the moral and political questions of her age. She understood that stability depended not only on the Queen's power but also on the careful maintenance of personal relationships. In this sense, she functioned as a kind of architect of peace within the turbulent environment of Elizabeth's court. Catherine Carey's role also carried emotional significance for the Queen. Elizabeth, despite her strength, lived a life of isolation. Her refusal to marry and her cautious trust in those around her left her vulnerable to loneliness. Catherine's companionship provided comfort that no minister or ambassador could offer. She was among the few who could speak candidly to the Queen without fear. Their bond was one of mutual dependence. Elizabeth found in her cousin a link to her own past, a reminder of the family she had lost, while Catherine found in Elizabeth the culmination of the family's ambitions. This intimacy gave Catherine a unique influence over the Queen's moods and decisions. Her counsel, offered in private, often shaped Elizabeth's responses to matters of state. The subtlety of Catherine's power is what makes her story so compelling. Unlike her aunt Anne Boleyn, whose ambition was public and provocative, Catherine operated behind the scenes. She did not seek titles or recognition. Her authority came from trust. Through her steady presence, she became a moral and emotional anchor for a queen who could trust few people completely. Her discretion allowed her to survive where many others fell. In a court famous for its intrigue, where a misplaced word could end a career or a life, Catherine's ability to maintain silence was a form of mastery. Her restraint made her indispensable, and her calmness lent the court a sense of continuity that was rare in Tudor England. Her influence also extended to the younger women who served alongside her. As a senior member of the Queen's household, Catherine set the tone for behavior and loyalty. She was known for her kindness, fairness, and dignity. The women who learned under her carried those lessons into their own roles at court and beyond. In this way, Catherine shaped not only the immediate circle around Elizabeth but also the broader culture of female service in the Tudor court. Her example demonstrated that influence could be maintained without arrogance and that power could be exercised through character as much as position. The context in which Catherine lived demanded constant vigilance. England was a nation still recovering from decades of upheaval. The religious settlement Elizabeth established was fragile, and threats from abroad, particularly from Catholic powers such as Spain, loomed large. Within this atmosphere, every decision, gesture, and word carried weight. Catherine's role in maintaining the Queen's composure and confidence during these years cannot be overstated. The Privy Chamber was where Elizabeth retreated to think, to grieve, and to plan. It was Catherine who often provided the quiet companionship that allowed the Queen to endure the pressures of rule. When Elizabeth faced rebellion or assassination plots, when she weighed the delicate question of succession, Catherine's steady presence reminded her of the personal strength that had carried her this far. In understanding Catherine Carey's significance, it is important to recognize that the Elizabethan court functioned as both a political machine and a personal network. Decisions were shaped as much by emotional loyalty as by formal counsel. The ability to influence the Queen's private thoughts often mattered more than any title or office. Catherine's unique position at the intersection of the personal and the political gave her a power that cannot be measured in documents or decrees. Her counsel did not appear in public records, but it resonated in the Queen's behavior, in her moments of restraint, and in her endurance during crises. It was Catherine's quiet wisdom that often helped maintain the balance that defined Elizabeth's reign. The religious tension of the time placed further demands on Catherine's skill as a mediator. The Queen's cautious Protestantism required delicate management of those who leaned too far toward either side of the divide. Catherine's family background gave her credibility among reformers, yet her demeanor allowed her to remain on good terms with moderates and even with some Catholics. This versatility made her invaluable in a court where factional conflict could easily turn deadly. She understood that the Queen's survival, and by extension, England's stability, depended on maintaining appearances of unity. Her personal faith, though sincere, never clouded her political judgment. In this sense, she embodied the same balance that made Elizabeth one of the most successful monarchs in English history. Catherine's contribution also lies in how she helped shape the image of the Queen. Elizabeth's public persona, the Virgin Queen, the embodiment of virtue and authority, was carefully constructed. Behind that image stood a team of attendants and confidants who managed her daily life, her wardrobe, her correspondence, and her interactions. Catherine's guidance in these intimate matters helped maintain the consistency of that image. She understood how appearances reinforced power, and she ensured that the Queen's private moments did not undermine her public strength. In this, she was both servant and strategist, preserving the illusion of unshakable majesty that defined Elizabeth's rule. Her death in the later years of the reign was a profound loss for the Queen. Elizabeth, who rarely allowed her emotions to show, mourned deeply. Those close to her noted a visible sadness in the Queen after Catherine's passing, a rare sign of vulnerability. It was not merely the loss of a trusted attendant but of a lifelong companion who had shared her burdens and memories. The depth of this grief reveals the extent of Catherine's importance. She had not only served the crown but had shaped the emotional and moral core of the Elizabethan monarchy. Her legacy lived on in the tone and stability of the court, in the generation of courtiers who had learned from her example, and in the enduring image of Elizabeth herself. Catherine Carey's life challenges modern assumptions about what constitutes power. In a world where influence was often equated with visibility, her authority was defined by its subtlety. She operated not through confrontation but through presence, not through command but through trust. Her story demonstrates how the most enduring forms of power are often those exercised quietly, in the spaces between public action and private counsel. Like Cleopatra Selene before her, she mastered the art of survival in a world that tested every woman who sought to navigate it with dignity. Both women transformed their inherited burdens into forms of quiet strength that reshaped the environments around them. By the time of her death, Catherine had become a symbol of constancy in an age of volatility. Her influence continued through her children, many of whom remained close to the royal family. Yet her true legacy lies not in lineage but in the culture of the court she helped sustain. She embodied the values that defined Elizabeth's reign: prudence, loyalty, moderation, and intellect. The peace and prosperity of that era owed much to the unseen labor of women like Catherine, who created the conditions in which the Queen could rule effectively. Without their devotion and tact, the image of Elizabeth as the confident, independent monarch might never have endured. Catherine Carey's life also reflects the broader pattern that connects the daughters and kin of great women throughout history. Like Empress Elizabeth Alexeievna and Cleopatra Selene, she lived in the shadow of a figure whose fame could easily have eclipsed her own. Yet she transformed that shadow into a space of influence. Her closeness to Elizabeth was not passive. It was an active form of service that shaped the course of English politics in ways often unseen. Through her example, we see that history's great transformations are rarely the work of a single hand. They are the cumulative result of many individuals whose dedication, empathy, and intelligence sustain the powerful and protect the fragile balance of their worlds. As the Elizabethan era drew to its close, England stood more unified and confident than it had in generations. The stability of the realm, the strength of the monarchy, and the flourishing of culture all bore traces of Catherine Carey's quiet influence. Her presence had helped Elizabeth endure the solitude of power and the constant threat of conflict. She had guided without commanding, advised without imposing, and shaped the fate of her nation through grace and steadfastness. Her story, though often overlooked, completes the lineage of women whose hidden influence carried the legacy of their foremothers into new forms of endurance and wisdom. Like those who came before her, Catherine Carey was an architect of destiny, not through force or spectacle, but through the quiet mastery of presence, loyalty, and faith. The story of Empress Elizabeth Alexeievna begins in a Russia still basking in the afterglow of Catherine the Great's long and transformative reign. The empire had expanded its territories, strengthened its institutions, and embraced many of the ideals of the Enlightenment that were reshaping Europe. Yet beneath this surface of imperial confidence, the seeds of discontent and reform were already being planted. Into this world stepped a woman whose life would quietly bridge two eras of Russian history: the grandeur of Catherine's enlightened despotism and the tremors of change that would one day culminate in open rebellion. Elizabeth Alexeievna, born Louise of Baden, became Empress of Russia through her marriage to Alexander, the eldest son of Emperor Paul, Catherine's successor. Though history often remembers her as a gentle and tragic figure overshadowed by her husband's turbulent reign, her influence on Russian society ran deeper than most realize. Through her intellect, her compassion, and her commitment to culture and education, she continued the spirit of reform her grandmother-in-law had begun, helping to nurture the intellectual climate that would later give rise to revolutionary thought. Elizabeth Alexeievna's early life was shaped by the refined, progressive atmosphere of the German Principality of Baden, where ideas of reason, education, and civic responsibility were prized. She received an education rare even for a princess of her time, one that emphasized philosophy, languages, and the arts alongside moral development. Her teachers instilled in her a deep appreciation for both beauty and knowledge, values that she carried with her to Russia when she married the young Grand Duke Alexander. She entered the Russian court as a teenager, arriving in a country vastly different from the quiet, rational world of her upbringing. The St. Petersburg court was magnificent but stifling, filled with intrigue and dominated by strict hierarchies. Catherine the Great, though nearing the end of her life, still set the tone for intellectual life in Russia, surrounding herself with scholars, artists, and reformers. In this environment, Elizabeth found inspiration and purpose. She admired Catherine's blend of strength and intellect and sought, in her own quieter way, to carry that tradition forward. When Catherine died and Paul ascended the throne, the atmosphere of the court changed dramatically. Paul's reign was marked by suspicion, harsh discipline, and reactionary policies that reversed many of his mother's reforms. For the young Elizabeth, this period was one of disillusionment. The intellectual openness that had characterized Catherine's court gave way to fear and rigidity. Yet even in this constrained environment, she continued to cultivate a circle of thinkers and artists who shared her belief in education and moral progress. Her private salons became spaces of quiet resistance to the suffocating orthodoxy of Paul's rule. She hosted discussions on philosophy and literature, corresponded with European intellectuals, and supported the translation of Western works into Russian. Though her influence at court was limited by Paul's erratic governance, her home became a refuge for ideas that might otherwise have been suppressed. The assassination of Paul and the accession of her husband Alexander marked a new beginning both for Elizabeth and for Russia. The young emperor was idealistic, haunted by guilt over his father's death, and torn between his sense of duty and his yearning for reform. Elizabeth, with her steady temperament and reflective intelligence, became a moderating force in his life. Their marriage was complicated by emotional distance and personal loss, but intellectually they shared a bond grounded in a shared desire to bring enlightenment to their vast and often backward empire. Under her gentle influence, Alexander's early reign took on the spirit of renewal that Russia had long awaited. The empress encouraged him to pursue policies inspired by reason and justice, to support education and to ease the burdens of serfdom. While her husband struggled to reconcile his ideals with the realities of autocracy, Elizabeth quietly worked to embody those ideals in her own initiatives. Her greatest contributions lay in her patronage of education, science, and charitable works. At a time when the Russian court remained dominated by tradition and rigid etiquette, she used her position to promote institutions that reflected the best of Enlightenment thought. She supported schools for girls, orphanages, and hospitals, many of which were founded under her personal supervision. Her involvement was not ceremonial. She took an active interest in the management of these institutions, reviewing reports, meeting with teachers, and ensuring that funds were used properly. She believed that education was the foundation of moral progress and that even the humblest subjects could be improved through learning. In this conviction, she echoed the values that Catherine the Great had championed decades earlier. Like her grandmother-in-law, Elizabeth understood that the strength of a nation rested not only on its armies and wealth but on the enlightenment of its people. Her efforts also extended to the arts, which she saw as essential to the spiritual and intellectual development of the nation. The empress became a patron of Russian painters, musicians, and writers, encouraging the growth of a distinctly Russian cultural identity that blended native traditions with European sophistication. She was instrumental in supporting young artists who later became central figures in the Russian artistic renaissance. Under her guidance, the court became a place not only of ceremony but of creativity. The salons she hosted attracted philosophers, poets, and reform-minded nobles who discussed the latest ideas coming from France and Germany. These gatherings helped to spread new ways of thinking that would later find expression in literature and politics. Though Elizabeth herself remained cautious in expressing overtly political views, her intellectual curiosity and generosity of spirit created an atmosphere where others could explore them. One of the most remarkable aspects of Elizabeth Alexeievna's influence was her ability to challenge the autocratic norms of her time without appearing to do so. She understood that open confrontation with the established order would lead only to suppression, yet she also recognized the need for change. Her approach was one of subtle transformation. Through her example, she encouraged members of the nobility to embrace compassion and responsibility, to see themselves not merely as servants of the state but as stewards of society. Her support for charitable organizations, particularly those aimed at helping women and children, reflected a new vision of social obligation. She believed that true nobility lay not in privilege but in service. This attitude quietly undermined the rigid class divisions that defined Russian life, planting the idea that the powerful had moral duties toward the powerless. Her correspondence reveals a mind deeply engaged with the moral and philosophical questions of her age. She read widely in European literature, particularly the works of Goethe, Schiller, and Rousseau, and discussed them with the intellectuals she welcomed to her court. These writings reinforced her belief in the potential for human improvement and the value of individual conscience. She often wrote of her desire to see Russia guided by reason rather than fear, compassion rather than coercion. Though she was careful to express these ideas within the bounds of loyalty to her husband and the throne, her words carried a quiet radicalism. They reflected a moral and intellectual continuity with Catherine the Great's Enlightenment ideals, reinterpreted for a new generation facing new challenges. The early years of Alexander's reign were filled with hope for reform, but as time passed, the realities of power and the pressures of the Napoleonic Wars tested that idealism. Elizabeth's influence persisted, though increasingly confined to the realm of culture and philanthropy rather than politics. She continued to promote education and charity even as the empire turned inward and reactionary forces regained strength. The years of war and unrest took a toll on her personally. She endured the loss of her daughters, the strain of her husband's infidelities, and the burden of public expectation. Yet she never abandoned her quiet mission to elevate the moral and intellectual tone of Russian society. Her resilience during these years earned her deep respect among those who knew her, even when official history failed to recognize her contributions. After the Napoleonic Wars, as Russia emerged as one of Europe's dominant powers, a new generation of educated nobles began to question the contradictions of their society. They admired Alexander's early reforms but were frustrated by his later retreat into conservatism. Many of them had been influenced directly or indirectly by the cultural and moral climate Elizabeth had helped to shape. The values of education, civic responsibility, and moral conscience that she had championed took root among the young officers and thinkers who would later form the nucleus of the Decembrist movement. Though she did not live to see their revolt, the ideas that animated it were part of the intellectual legacy she had fostered. The Decembrists sought to reconcile loyalty to the crown with a belief in justice and freedom, an impulse that can be traced back to the moral idealism of both Catherine and Elizabeth. It would be easy to dismiss Elizabeth Alexeievna's influence as purely domestic or cultural, but such a view underestimates the power of ideas in shaping history. Her salons, her schools, and her correspondence all helped to create a network of thought that bridged the gap between autocracy and reform. By nurturing a generation of educated and morally aware nobles, she laid the groundwork for the social conscience that would later challenge the very system she served. In this sense, she was both a product and a catalyst of her age, a woman who carried forward the intellectual torch of Catherine the Great while preparing the soil for future change. Her later years were marked by introspection and quiet dignity. As Alexander's reign grew more conservative and the emperor himself withdrew into spiritual melancholy, Elizabeth became a symbol of grace and endurance. She spent much of her time supporting hospitals and orphanages, personally visiting the sick and the poor. These acts of compassion were not mere gestures of charity but expressions of a deeper belief in the moral responsibility of rulers. She once wrote that a sovereign must rule, not through fear but through the example of goodness, a sentiment that captured the essence of her philosophy. Though her influence faded from political circles, her moral authority endured. Elizabeth's death in the early decades of the 19th century marked the end of an era, but her legacy continued to resonate. The cultural and intellectual movements that blossomed in Russia after her time, the literary renaissance of Pushkin's generation, the philosophical debates of the intelligentsia, and the moral fervor of the reformers, all carried echoes of her vision. The ideal of a compassionate, enlightened Russia that valued both tradition and progress found its roots in the atmosphere she helped to create. Her life demonstrated that influence need not be loud or overt to be transformative. Like the daughters and kin of other great women before her, she wielded power not through decrees but through ideas, shaping hearts and minds in ways that would endure long after her death. Her story also completes the lineage of women whose quiet strength sustained and transformed the legacies they inherited. Catherine the Great had brought reason and reform to an empire that was often resistant to both. Her granddaughter by marriage, Elizabeth Alexeievna, carried that legacy forward into a new century, translating Enlightenment ideals into acts of compassion and education. Together, they represent two generations of women who used their intellect and humanity to challenge the rigid structures of their world. The continuity between them is unmistakable. Both believed in the potential of education to elevate society, both saw art and culture as instruments of progress, and both understood that moral authority could be as powerful as political command. In the grand narrative of Russian history, Elizabeth Alexeievna's name may not carry the same weight as Catherine's, but her impact is woven into the very fabric of the nation's evolution. The Decembrist officers who rose in protest, the writers who explored questions of conscience and freedom, the reformers who dreamed of a juster Russia, all inherited, knowingly or not, the intellectual and moral foundations she helped to build. Her life stands as a reminder that revolutions do not begin only with battles or manifestos. They begin in minds awakened by compassion and guided by reason. In nurturing that awakening, she became one of the unseen architects of Russia's journey from autocracy toward conscience. The story of Empress Elizabeth Alexeievna joins that of Catherine Carey and Cleopatra Selene as part of a larger tapestry. The tale of women who, though overshadowed by their more famous relatives, carried forward their legacies in new forms. Each, in her own time and place, embodied the enduring strength of quiet influence. Their worlds were bound by restraint, yet within those bounds they found the freedom to shape history. Elizabeth's Russia, like Elizabeth's England and Cleopatra's Mauretania, was transformed not by spectacle but by the steady labor of minds and hearts committed to enlightenment. Her life reminds us that the most profound revolutions often begin not in the streets but in the salons, schools, and letters of those who dare to imagine a better world, even when they must do so in whispers. The stories of Cleopatra Selene, Catherine Carey, and Elizabeth Alexeievna form a continuous thread through centuries of history, connecting empires and courts that were worlds apart yet bound by a shared pattern of power and silence. Each woman lived in the shadow of a figure whose fame seemed too vast to escape. Cleopatra Selene was the daughter of Cleopatra, the queen whose name became synonymous with seduction and empire. Catherine Carey was the cousin and lifelong companion of Elizabeth, the queen whose reign defined an era. Elizabeth Alexeievna was the granddaughter by marriage of Catherine the Great, the ruler who brought the ideals of the Enlightenment to the Russian throne. Their mothers or kin were immortalized as rulers of exceptional strength and ambition, yet the women who came after them were often reduced to footnotes, remembered only in relation to their bloodlines. This tendency to overlook daughters, even those of extraordinary capability, reveals something profound about the way history has long been written, celebrating the visible power of monarchs while neglecting the quieter influence that shapes societies from within. These three women, though separated by geography and time, shared a struggle for recognition that transcended their circumstances. They inherited both privilege and expectation, their lives molded by the legacies of women who had defied convention to command nations. Yet they also bore the burden of comparison. To be born or raised near a queen was to live under constant scrutiny, where even acts of compassion or intellect could be interpreted as ambition. In every generation, these daughters learned to navigate worlds that expected them to remain decorative while demanding they uphold dynasties. Their triumphs were subtle, their rebellions measured, yet their impact was lasting. They did not seize thrones through conquest, but they reshaped ideas about leadership, knowledge, and moral authority in ways that changed the societies around them. Cleopatra Selene began her life as a captive and ended it as a queen. She was the child of Egypt's most famous ruler and the Roman general who had sought to conquer her world. When her parents died and her homeland fell, she was taken to Rome as a symbol of victory, her existence a living reminder of empire's reach. Few could have imagined that she would rise from this humiliation to rebuild a kingdom of her own. In Mauretania, alongside her husband Juba, she combined Roman discipline with Egyptian heritage, creating a court that became a center of art and scholarship. Her reign may not have matched her mother's grandeur, but it embodied a subtler kind of power, the ability to endure, to adapt, and to preserve culture under foreign rule. Through her, the legacy of the Ptolemy did not vanish but transformed, surviving in the arts, architecture, and intellectual traditions she nurtured. She stands as a testament to resilience, showing that even in defeat, a woman could redefine sovereignty. Catherine Carey's story unfolded in a world no less perilous, though its battles were fought in words and alliances rather than on battlefields. She was born into a family forever entangled with the ambitions of the Tudor dynasty. Her mother, Mary Boleyn, had once been mistress to Henry, and her cousin Elizabeth would become the monarch whose reign set the standard for female authority in English history. Catherine's own power came not from title but from proximity. As Chief Lady of the Privy Chamber, she was the person the Queen trusted most, a silent witness to both statecraft and solitude. She learned to read the shifting tides of religion and politics in a court divided between Protestant reformers and Catholic loyalists, balancing faith with loyalty in a way that preserved not only her own survival but also the Queen's stability. In her restraint and discretion lay her strength. Every message she carried, every conversation she guarded, helped maintain the delicate balance of the Elizabethan court. Without the trust she earned and the loyalty she offered, Elizabeth's reign might have been far more turbulent. Catherine's influence, though unrecorded in proclamations, was embedded in the daily workings of power. In the grandeur of the Russian Empire, Elizabeth Alexeievna embodied another form of unseen strength. She inherited the intellectual legacy of Catherine the Great but lived in an age when ideals and reality often collided. Her marriage to Alexander placed her at the heart of a court torn between reform and reaction, between the promise of enlightenment and the weight of autocracy. Yet rather than confront power directly, she chose to cultivate it through compassion and intellect. Her patronage of education, her support for orphanages and schools, and her encouragement of the arts created spaces where progress could take root even in times of repression. She believed that the spirit of a nation could be elevated not by decrees but by the spread of knowledge and kindness. Her quiet defiance of the rigid hierarchies of Russian society planted the moral seeds that would later blossom into movements for reform. Though she never held political authority, her influence reached beyond her lifetime, shaping the conscience of the generations that followed. Together, these women reveal how history's margins often contain its deepest truths. They demonstrate that power need not always be visible to be real. Cleopatra Selene ruled not through empire but through culture. Catherine Carey shaped governance not through decrees but through loyalty. Elizabeth Alexeievna guided her nation not through law but through moral example. Each was bound by the expectations of her time yet found within those boundaries the freedom to act. Their achievements remind us that the legacy of great queens does not end with their reigns but continues through the women who inherit their visions and adapt them to new realities. Yet their stories have too often been marginalized. The historical record, written largely by men who valued conquest over compassion and public triumph over private influence, has long neglected women whose power operated behind the scenes. Chroniclers celebrated the drama of battles and treaties but rarely the patient diplomacy of those who kept peace within palaces. They remembered the rulers who built empires but not the daughters who kept their ideals alive after their deaths. Even when these women appeared in history, they were often reduced to supporting roles: daughters of Cleopatra, cousins of Elizabeth, consorts of Alexander, never as individuals with their own purpose. This erasure was not accidental. It reflected a broader reluctance to acknowledge that influence can take forms other than domination, that empathy and intellect can shape history as effectively as armies and crowns. Re-examining their lives invites us to question how history chooses its heroes. Cleopatra Selene's achievements were overshadowed by the fascination with her mother's tragic romance. Catherine Carey's loyalty was absorbed into the mythology of the Virgin Queen, whose image left no room for equals. Elizabeth Alexeievna's reforms were eclipsed by the dramas of her husband's reign and the revolutions that followed. In each case, the narrative of the great woman consumed the stories of those around her. Yet by recovering these forgotten lives, we gain a fuller understanding of what made those great women possible. Queens do not rule in isolation. Their strength is sustained by networks of kin and companions who carry their vision forward. The unseen daughters are not merely reflections of their mothers but continuations of their legacies in new forms. Their shared struggle also reveals how women's power has often been defined by its relationship to men and how that framing distorts the truth. Cleopatra Selene's authority was framed as her husband's gift, though it was her intellect that shaped their kingdom's culture. Catherine Carey's service was described as devotion to her queen, though it was also a mastery of the court's hidden mechanisms. Elizabeth Alexeievna's compassion was dismissed as virtue rather than strategy, though it advanced a moral transformation that outlasted political change. To recognize their agency is not to diminish the achievements of their more famous relatives but to enrich the picture of how power truly functioned. It reminds us that history's great transformations often begin in the margins, among those whose names are mentioned only in passing. The silence surrounding these women also reflects how history has long valued spectacle over substance. Cleopatra's drama, Elizabeth's solitude, and Catherine the Great's ambition all made for grand narratives, but the quieter persistence of their daughters did not fit the mold of heroism. Yet their endurance may be the greater legacy. Cleopatra Selene rebuilt a world after catastrophe. Catherine Carey maintained stability in an age of religious strife. Elizabeth Alexeievna fostered compassion in a court governed by fear. Their strength lay not in defiance but in endurance, not in claiming power but in transforming it into something humane. To bring their stories to light is to challenge the boundaries of history itself. It asks us to look beyond the monuments and the crowns, beyond the figures who dominate textbooks, and to see the networks of influence that make greatness possible. It compels us to understand that the shaping of the world has always been a collective act, one in which daughters, companions, and consorts played indispensable roles. Re-evaluating their place in history is not an act of sentiment but of justice, a correction to the distortion that equates visibility with significance. The true measure of influence lies not in the number of statues raised in one's honor but in the ideas and values that endure long after death. The lives of Cleopatra Selene, Catherine Carey, and Elizabeth Alexeievna offer a model for how we might rethink history itself. They show that power is not a fixed inheritance but a dialogue between generations. Cleopatra Selene transformed the ruins of her mother's empire into a new cultural synthesis. Catherine Carey translated Elizabeth's political cunning into loyalty and steadiness that sustained a monarchy through crisis. Elizabeth Alexeievna reinterpreted Catherine the Great's Enlightenment ideals into acts of compassion that would inspire reformers long after her passing. In each case, the daughter did not merely imitate the mother but reimagined her legacy to meet the needs of a changing world. This continuity of adaptation is what keeps history alive. Their collective story also reminds us that history is not only written by victors but by survivors. These women survived the collapse of dynasties, the intrigues of courts, and the expectations that confined them. They endured by transforming limitation into opportunity. In doing so, they helped to redefine what it meant to lead and to serve. Their lives challenged the notion that influence must be loud or visible to be meaningful. Instead, they show that the most enduring legacies are often those built quietly, through intellect, loyalty, and compassion. As we revisit their stories, we are also invited to reconsider the stories still hidden in the margins of history. For every Cleopatra Selene, there are countless daughters whose contributions remain unrecorded. For every Catherine Carey, countless confidants whose wisdom sustained monarchs. For every Elizabeth Alexeievna, countless women whose acts of kindness shaped the moral fabric of nations. To study them is not merely to fill gaps in the record but to redefine the narrative itself. It means acknowledging that history is not the story of isolated heroes but of interconnected lives, that progress depends as much on empathy as on ambition. This awareness carries implications beyond scholarship. It challenges how we view power in our own time. The lessons of these women speak to a broader truth, that enduring influence arises from integrity, intelligence, and perseverance, not from spectacle or domination. In an age that still struggles to recognize women's authority, their examples remain instructive. They remind us that true leadership often resides in the willingness to serve, to educate, and to inspire rather than to command. Their legacies continue to echo because they represent the enduring human capacity to find purpose even in the shadow of greatness. To honor them is to look again at the pages of history and ask whose voices have been left out. It is to seek the stories of those who worked in silence, whose achievements were absorbed into the reputations of others. By bringing these stories forward, we do more than recover forgotten names. We reclaim a fuller understanding of the past. In recognizing Cleopatra Selene's rebuilding, Catherine Carey's loyalty, and Elizabeth Alexeievna's compassion, we also acknowledge the many ways in which women have shaped civilization through intellect, endurance, and grace. The time has come to move beyond the narrow focus on monarchs and conquerors and to explore the intricate web of relationships that truly define eras. History's richness lies not in its loudest moments but in its continuities, the threads of influence that pass from one generation to another, often unnoticed. The unseen daughters were not merely witnesses to greatness. They were its inheritors and interpreters. Their lives remind us that every legend has an afterlife and that those who live it out deserve to be remembered. As we reflect on their legacies, we are reminded that the past is not fixed but alive, shaped by the stories we choose to tell. By reclaiming the narratives of women like Cleopatra Selene, Catherine Carey, and Elizabeth Alexeievna, we restore balance to the record and broaden our understanding of what it means to lead, to endure, and to influence. There's our stories of quiet revolutions. Revolutions of thought, of empathy, and of survival. They urge us to keep searching for the voices still hidden in the archives, to listen for the echoes that persist beneath the noise of conquest and fame. In doing so, we not only honor these women but also redefine the way we engage with history itself. Each rediscovered life becomes an invitation to look closer, to question assumptions, and to recognize the power that exists in persistence and intellect. The unseen daughters may not have ruled empires, but they reshaped them from within, leaving marks that time could not erase. Their echoes reach us still, reminding us that greatness often hides in plain sight, waiting for those willing to listen.